Oscar is on paper the CEO, but he's also the master broom sweeper.
I am still this.
Yes, you can relate, I was going to say. Lance from SEY Coffee. You and I have known each other for 10-ish years. I wanted to ask you to share with me and everybody else a little bit about your personal coffee journey. How long have you been in coffee?
I actually don't know how long I've been in coffee to the year. It's got to be over 15 at this point, but not sure the exact number. But I started working in coffee shops in Seattle when I was in college and got a what turns out to be relatively useless degree in philosophy. Yeah. And so once I graduated from college, I kind of just continued working in coffee shops. I was lucky enough to work in at the time, relatively famous coffee shop called Vivace in Seattle. Got very good at latte art. That's about it, but got good at latte art. And so from there, and this was kind of like before latte art was actually like a global thing, I was kind of able to wander around and work in different coffee shops and pour latte art and, get to see, the world kind of through coffee, which was like a really interesting way to travel, especially as like someone in their early 20s. And
this is amazing. I never knew about your latte art background.
Yeah,
for
I
me,
latte
you're
art.
like the coffee purist, and it turns out you're like Lance, the latte art guy.
Yeah, essentially that's how I started. Well, I mean, to be fair, I started out as Lance, the dishwasher guy, because at Vivace they would make us wash dishes for about a year to a year and a half before we were even allowed to touch espresso machines back then, which was interesting. So washed a lot of dishes. Then became the latte art guy. But like also specialty coffee 15 years ago was a very different thing. I mean, I think Vivace still uses like Monsoon Malabar Robusta in their espresso blend. So it's like, we didn't have, single origin, even single varieties, separations of any kind. So, so it's like specialty coffee was very much at its infancy.
Yeah.
So it was more like the culture around coffee shops that I was like originally attracted to. And then, through that, I was able to kind of use it as a way of traveling and, picking up random shifts at random places. And yeah, using it as a way to kind of like move around. And that kind of took me all over the place. And then I ended up in New York. Finally, I had kind of like lived everywhere on the West Coast, up and down Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, LA, all of them. But had never really been to the West Coast or the East Coast. So kind of went through Canada, came over to Europe, and kind of ended up in New York. So at that time, Stumptown, which is like one of the, bigger specialty brands in the US, just opened their first coffee shop in
the one on
New York.
8th Street or?
No, the one in the Ace Hotel on, I think, 23rd.
Right. Yeah.
So that was their first coffee shop, and that was before they sold. It was still, Stumptown from Portland, Dwayne, the whole thing. So I got a job there, and that was kind of like my first actual introduction to, what we would consider like single origin specialty coffee, and worked there for a while. And at that time, like in New York, nobody else was actually roasting coffee or like specialty coffee. Stumptown was really the first. Years later, Intelligentsia came. I still think is around. But like back then, it was really just Stumptown and all of the entire city. That is the massive monstrosity of New York. We had one specialty roaster and that was it. So I kind of like faced the dilemma that I think a lot of people in the coffee industry face, which is like, how do I get, out of being a barista into some sort of career in coffee? And that was a really, really challenging thing to try to navigate. And, getting some sort of like QC position or green buying position or roasting position at Stumptown or really anywhere back then was virtually impossible because there was like, 5 of those jobs in the entire United States. So it's like, good luck.
Yeah.
So yeah. And at the time I was working with my friend Tobin. He was also from, he's from New Mexico. Actually, we met in LA. he moved to Seattle. We lived in Seattle together for a while, and he also started working in coffee through college or at the end of college. And then we were working at Stumptown together in New York. So both of us were like, hey, maybe we give this a go.
And this is around the time that you and I had our first interaction. I don't remember, either you and I or Tobin and I had met in New York, and then a few months later, the two of you
met Tobin first.
I think that's right. And then you and Tobin decided you wanted to come to Sweden.
Well, that was after we started.
That was later.
Yeah, so we tried to start roasted coffee. I bought a 1 pound San Franciscan to try to be like, okay, let's try to dip our toes into this roasting coffee thing. Also, we had started tasting coffees from Scandinavia, primarily, Coffee Collective, Temo Debo, Drop. Those were the big three back then. So, we had been tasting coffees from there, and they were approaching coffee roasting differently than we had experienced in anything in the United States, 12, 13, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And we were like, okay, what's going on here? And again, this is even before we knew how to measure extractions, how to do anything.
Yeah.
But we were still able to be like, something's different here. It's lighter, it's more expressive. There's more nuance, there's more articulation. It's just, this is different.
Yeah.
So we were really intrigued by that. And we were kind of like, how, if we're going to start roasting coffee, we would like to try to do something more similar to this. And that ended up being far more challenging than we had originally anticipated. So we probably roasted coffee for maybe a year. And, roasted coffee, cupped coffees,
on the San Franciscan.
All the while trying to figure out what do we do here? And it was actually, do you know there's coffee shop culture?
Yes.
Maybe I shouldn't actually name people on this podcast. But so there was a coffee shop, and they were like, if you start roasting coffee, we will buy coffee from you. And they were a super busy, large account. They probably move, 300 pounds of coffee a week. So it was like, okay,
wow,
this is a lot. We could actually build a business off of this one account and kind of grow from there. And they were like, yep, we want to support you, blah, blah, blah. You buy the roaster. You start roasting coffee, we'll buy the coffee. So we were like, okay, let's take the jump. We bought a Probat L12, 1988. I do not recommend anybody doing this. Especially buying old Probats. Don't recommend old Probats. But that's what we did because, at the time, old Probats were the cool thing to do. And yeah, we did that. And then the coffee shop was like, cool, we actually don't want to buy coffee from you.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So we ended up with a roaster and nobody to sell coffee to. And also kind of not super happy with the coffee that we were roasting. Because also at that time, trying to get information about how to roast coffee or any sort of feedback on coffee was virtually impossible. I still think it's impossible. And I think it's something that our industry really needs to kind of deal with to some sort of capacity. But it's also a really complicated conversation.
Also today, there is a lot more information. I mean, just the information, whether you're talking about roasting or brewing or extracting or even latte art, there's so much information today compared to 10 years ago.
There is. There's at least enough information that can get you started. Where back then there was absolutely nothing.
No.
So I ended up having to work at a coffee shop called Buden. And just to try to make ends meet while we were trying to continue getting our little roastery off the ground. And so that's when I first got really, involved in working with copies from Drop, Temo Debo, and Coffee Collective.
Right.
Because they were actually bringing them into New York.
To Buden.
Yeah.
I remember, yeah.
Yeah.
That was really exciting.
Yeah, it was a super cool coffee shop. Yeah, it was lovely. R.I.P. Buden. And so that's when I first got really introduced to Drop specifically. I thought that copies from Drop and Joanna were just incredible. And we were like, well, we're not doing very well here. We're not good at teaching ourselves how to roast coffee.
I realized I took the wrong box. It's roasted today.
Oh, yeah.
And Yeah, decided to like maybe try to get some consulting.
I remember getting like an email, and it very likely from Tobin saying like, we want to come to Stockholm. Is this something you can help us out with? And at the time, Joanna had taken over the major responsibility of roasting at Drop, and so if anybody was gonna. If you were to experience this with anybody, it was with Joanna, of course, who was obviously a master at what she does.
Totally.
Yeah.
So yeah, we came over here and we spent, I don't know, like 3 or 4 days just kind of roasting and cupping. And really just getting like a starting point. Like, you know, like the variables of roasting coffee are literally infinite. So like getting at least being like, okay, this is this point of which we can actually just kind of like start at, and then we can kind of move from here was actually very challenging. And, you know, that's really what we were able to get from Joanna at Drop, you know, that many years ago, was basically just like, okay, like here we can start. Yeah. And that was just like infinitely valuable. Yeah. And obviously from there, like we, at this point, you know, have entirely different theories and different philosophies on how to roast coffee and all of these things.
10 years have passed. Yeah.
But
everything is different.
But back then that was just like so helpful. And also trying to roast coffee on an old Probat is, in my opinion, absolutely impossible. So especially if you're trying to do it in the way that we were trying to do it, which is like as light as possible, as expressive as possible, but still soluble. Right. And also we didn't know how to measure solubility back then. So it was just like we were, you know, trying to get properly developed coffee on a drum roasters. That light is very, very, very challenging. So that was like kind of the beginning of roasting. And that was kind of like where we actually were like, okay, cool. We can roast a drinkable coffee at this point. Yeah. And then from there, we had some friends in New York that were like, cool, we'll start buying a little bit of your coffee. I will throw a little bit of a shout out to Gavin at Variety, who like actually took a gigantic leap and was like, we'll buy quite a bit of coffee from you because you're cool. And probably without that, I don't know if we would have actually survived.
Amazing. I didn't know that about Variety being such a integral part of your establishing. And again, you know, at the time, I remember coming and visiting you at the loft, the Probat, sort of by the wall, and cupping and brewing coffees with you there. I always loved. It was such a unusual situation that you had there. It was one of my favorite spots to come and visit. Really.
Yeah. No, it was a special place. You know, and a lot of challenging, you know, unique problems to solve, you know, being 4 stories in the air with, you know, trying to move green coffee in and out and roasted coffee out. It's like, it was an absolute nightmare.
Oh my God.
But, you know.
But let's jump ahead a few years because, so we've established the sort of origin story, but now you're like, I mean, again, speaking of favorite stops to visit, you've been running, SEY, the coffee roastery, in this amazing location with this amazing coffee bar plant experience in a wonderful space in a dynamic part of Brooklyn. Tell me a little bit about like SEY Coffee. How do you usually describe what's happening or what you do?
I like to think about SEY as like a continuing evolution. And most of that is an evolution of us as the people that kind of like work it and own it. I, as kind of like the copy director or whatever, the green buyer, head of QC, whatever. Like every year I get better at tasting coffees. Every year I get better at buying coffees. Every year we get better at roasting coffees. Every year we get better at brewing coffees. So one of the things that like is like a keystone of like what I believe is like a you know, or a pillar of what SEY is kind of always being in a constant state of evolution. One of the things when I was a barista that really bothered me the most, or I got most frustrated about, is like when I was working at a coffee shop and a new grinder would come out or whatever, and you would be like, can we get the new grinder? And the owner of the cafe would be like, no, that's like $3,000 or whatever.
Yeah.
And you're like, cool, I get that. But like you sell one thing and it's coffee. Like, let's invest in the one thing that you sell. Like, let's invest in it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I just really got frustrated with companies that were like, this is where we go, this is where we stop. And then that's just as far as that goes.
Right.
And
Right.
so, you know, when we started Stay, it was like, you know, we wanted to build into the ethos or the core of the company that was like, this will be a forever changing, from trying to progress, trying to get better. Every day we ask ourselves, okay, we did this thing, how do we do this better? And that is like built into the core of what we're doing. So from the beginning, it has always kind of been a process and evolution. We roast coffee differently every week. And, you know, that's something that I think is still kind of novel in our industry. Like people are like, you know, what's your style, or like, what do you do? And it's like, you know, even if it's the same coffee, we cup that coffee, we will make an adjustment the next week on how we roast that coffee. So every week, even if it is the exact same coffee, it will be approached slightly differently. And I think that's really important.
And one of the things that I've enjoyed coming to visit you at the roastery has been like and not only you, but I mean you and the team at SEY, you're like pushing boundaries. At least that's how I see it. Whether we're talking about like extracting coffee, I remember a couple of years ago I visited you and you spoke about like, oh, I'm not only cupping coffee, but we're brewing coffee in the bar at a much higher extraction than previously, because it would reveal everything about a coffee and whether it was well roasted or not, and so on. And I literally flew home to Stockholm and brought that to part of our operation here in a super concrete way. So, you know, I went from like, Oscar, you know how we usually have the dial here? Now it's here. He was like,
grind
what?
finer.
Yeah.
Go slower, grind finer.
And so, you know, that's one aspect. Another aspect is about like, I was going to say gladly paying more for higher quality green coffee. Yep. And again, pushing, whether it's the, you know, private coffee enthusiasts who are your subscribers or customers, or your wholesale account partners, getting people to pay more for really high quality coffee.
Yeah. I mean, the cost of green coffee is obviously like a complicated one. And I haven't heard anyone that has actually good answers, you know, for the problem of coffee costs. And, you know, so, but I mean, I think that is also part of the reason, like, why we find that to be so intriguing. And what that it's like kind of born out of is, so I kind of like think of coffee as in multiple generations, or like at least a couple generations. It's not that old yet, but when I first started trying to buy green coffee, and I reached out to like importers and exporters, and they would be like, cool, here's a coffee. And I'm like, cool, how much does it cost? And they're like, X amount. And I'm like, cool, is that a good price? Because, like, you know, we're kind of at that point where like coffee should cost a certain amount. You know, specialty coffee is built on this, like, we're paying sustainable prices for coffee and blah, 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 15 years ago. And, you know, to then the exporter or the importer then be like, I don't know.
Right.
You know, and you're like, wait, what do you mean you don't know?
Yeah.
You're like, you don't know like what sustainable priced coffee should cost? Because, you know, a lot of companies have built their entire brand off of, you know, marketing themselves as buying sustainable coffee. So what do you mean we don't know what sustainable priced coffee means? And to take that 15 years ago to now, and if you were to ask me personally, maybe other people have answers to this question that I don't know, but if you were to ask me what a sustainable price coffee is, I still don't know the answer to that question, nor do I know anyone that has answers to that question. So I think that that's fascinating, and it's a really interesting part of the industry to engage in.
But you do know that you're paying more than you did 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Which I think is important. And, you know, what I do know is I have never met a coffee producer that was like, I make enough money.
Right.
So, I mean, outside of like, you know, some crazy people. Famous producers in Panama and a handful around the world.
Yeah.
You know, most producers that I go visit, you know, no one has been like, I'm happy, I'm good with the prices that I'm getting for coffee. That has like never been my experience. So, even as we continue to pay more and more and more for coffee, as like the specialty industry, there is still an obvious lack of resources for the actual producers, and trying to figure out like what that is, or like what the solution for that is obviously very complicated, but one that I think that we continually need to interact with more. I think we need to continue asking those questions, and I think that we need to do a better job and continue to do a better job about asking those questions. And it does get really complicated and brings up a lot of very strange existential questions and existential problems about like value. Where in the supply chain does value exist? Where should it exist? Right now, I would argue that the vast majority of the value exists here in our very fancy roasting machines. And, I question that a lot.
Yeah.
It's like, is it more work to produce an 88-point coffee, or is it more challenging to roast it really, really well? I would argue that it's more challenging to produce an 88-point coffee. So why isn't more of the value being held in the production of the actual raw product than it is in the actual roasting of the coffee?
Right.
And the obvious answer is that it's here because this is where, we consume it, and we can brand it, we can market it, and there's a lot of, value in all of that. But, I've got a lot of questions around the supply chain, where the value of the coffee, falls and exists in the supply chain.
But it seems to me that
it's complicated.
You've made a certain amount of like decisions regarding all these various aspects that are very complex, as you describe. One of the decisions you've made is to only work with microlots, like individual lots by individual producers.
Yeah.
The traditional model is to have, the blend or whatever,
Sure.
or something less specific. You were previously talking about like you're trying to buy really very, very high quality coffees. Some of the microlots are 2 bags. If you get a microlot that's 10 bags, you feel fortunate. Talk to me a little bit about your like what goes into choosing coffees.
Yeah, so we are potentially not how do I say this, in trend at the moment. We primarily still stick with or try to purchase and only work with as clean of coffees as we can possibly find. I do think that like the experimental processing of coffees and trying to like go into that world and see what is there is infinitely interesting. I'm super happy that it exists. If you were to ask me my personal, like where I would fall personally in that conversation, I would say I think that it's very good and interesting to add value to coffees that just can't be as good or get enough, be worth enough to like actually sustain that farm. So for example, if you have a farm in Colombia at 1,300 meters above sea level, you grow 100% Castillo, you do everything perfectly, you produce an 82-point coffee.
Right.
You do everything perfectly.
Right.
And at best, you produce an 82-point coffee. Yeah, like throw some anaerobic fermentation on top of that. And if you can get more money for it, absolutely.
Right,
like I'm totally for this. And
because
I think that is a really
that will enable the producer to earn more money per produced pound.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like trying to increase value for these coffees that just, will never be, 86, 87, 88-point coffees, just primarily, based on where they're actually being grown, I think is a huge value add for the producing countries and for the industry at large, But if we're talking about 90-point, geishas or even, 88-point Katuras, if we're going to stick in Colombia, grown at 2,000 meters above sea level, that is incredible. Like, in my opinion, an 88-point Katura from Colombia is by far potentially the rarest coffee in the world at this point. It's like, let's not maybe like
mess with it.
Yeah, throw a bunch of like wacky fermentation on it, because that is probably the rarest, coffee at this point in the world. And So that's kind of like where I fall. And, this is going to potentially be a controversial statement, but, I do find that you could take an 88-point Caturra, and if you put it in a barrel long enough and anaerobic, ferment it for long enough, and you took that 1,300 meter, Castillo and fermented it the exact same way, those coffees are going to taste really similar.
Yeah.
So it's like, why? And
right.
And I think that like as we continue going down these roads and as we continue to become more sophisticated as coffee tasters, and what do we find to be valuable because like it's a subjective thing, like where do we find value and what do we want to put value in? I think that we will probably go to be like, okay, like that clean washed 88-point Caturra is more valuable than like a 400 hour fermented Castillo at 1,300 meters. But I still think that we're kind of like in the middle of that conversation now.
I think that one has to have the long perspective and see that there needs to people need to work it out. It'll take time for people to try everything. What works, what doesn't work, when is it necessary, when is it totally unnecessary, and then we'll land somewhere in a more moderate place, hopefully in the end.
Yeah. So like, to go back to your original question, though, it's like what I'm interested in as like the coffee buyer for SEY is I'm still vastly interested in what is actual coffee taste like, because like I still don't think that we actually know, if I'm being totally honest. It's like, what does Caturra or a Castillo or a Variedad Colombia or an SL28 now, because that's becoming more popular, grown in San Agustin, specifically in Huila. Like I've got a decent idea, but like I don't have a great idea. And, so it's like breaking down what coffee actually tastes like from a variety standpoint, from a location standpoint, and really getting the nuance of that, I think is like vastly interesting. And I still don't think we as an industry have become very sophisticated at that. So that's what I'm still interested in, is like, I want to taste as pure a representation of that coffee in a place as I can possibly get. So then I can start, developing a more sophisticated way of tasting those coffees, working with those coffees, evaluating those coffees, just understanding coffee in general. Whereas as soon as you get into like some processing sort of stuff, you lose a lot of that, and then it becomes very, very challenging, because like the majority of what you're tasting in the cup is the processing, not necessarily the actual coffee itself. So what I'm still interested in doing is like, what does this variety in this certain place taste like in its purest state? And I'm still learning, and I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm still learning every year.
But having said that, it does sound like you have an audience who's really interested in what you're exploring. I mean, obviously you have very likely one level of enthusiasts who are super geeky and maybe comparing different varieties from San Agustin and Huila, just like you are. But you also have it seems to me at least, a very solid wholesale business in SEY, and maybe the various coffee bars and restaurants that are buying your coffee are less geeky about it, but they certainly seem to really enjoy the coffees that you choose and the style of roasting that you have.
I'd like to think so, and hope so. Generally, like where we kind of fall on like a lot of the kind of feedback that I get, or just kind of like vibe that I, or energy that I get from the industry at this point, is like our wholesale accounts generally are multi-roasters, and they'll use us or bring us in for like the clean coffees. Because there's like plenty of other roasters that they're getting, more experimental coffees from. So like if they are interested in using washed clean coffees, usually they'll come talk to us about that. And we'll kind of be able to provide that, whole for their menu, if it's like a curated menu. But it is like a really interesting conversation to engage with globally. And because we don't do any really experimental or processed coffees. And yeah, I find it to be a really, really interesting conversation.
But it seems that I mean, you're buying really high quality green coffee. You're roasting it, going back to the Nordic style. You're at least lighter and more transparent of a sensory experience when you drink your coffees compared to other styles of roasters coffees in the US at least. It seems like you have a very high quality green coffee. You're roasting it really, really well. You're also charging more per pound or kilo compared to other roasteries. So it does seem that you really have like an audience who's very enthusiastic about what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the audience globally is just getting bigger, and I think it'll continue getting bigger year after year after year. Like as more and more people like taste coffee, and I think the pandemic also like really changed things. Like we saw a massive increase in our subscriptions through the pandemic as like people are like, I'm home forever, and I guess I'll get into coffee now. A lot of people got really into coffee through the pandemic. I mean, if you just look at the market of high-end grinders, it's like absolutely insane. So like, I think that will continue building, and I think it will continue growing, and I hope that it does, because, coffee, it kind of goes back to like the sustainability question of coffee. And right now, I would argue that I don't think that we are in a sustainable, place for coffee. So, I also kind of generally tend to say the very unpopular thing, which is like, I'm not entirely sure coffee should exist as it is today. I know.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, that is controversial.
Yeah.
No, but just, if we look at prices per pound or kilo for green coffee, and then you compare it to inflation over the last
it's absurd.
100 years,
that's absurd.
Then point made.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
No.
It's not a sustainable business model where we are right now.
Certainly not for small producers.
Right. Certainly not for small producers, and certainly not for producers who are selling commercial grade coffee to commercial roasteries.
Right. Unless you have like 100-hectare farm in, Brazil. Yeah.
True. But again, going back to the prices that I'm guessing that you're paying for your green, or you're actually very transparent. It says on the box how much you paid for coffee. So I'm not guessing. I know that you're paying a really decent amount for the coffee that you buy. So at least you're, pushing the envelope here a bit.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's very challenging to talk about prices for me, because like I can't actually be here and being like, this coffee sustainably purchased. Right. Like I really can't say that. And like really the point of even being, transparent about our pricing is really just to actually start a conversation about it. Right. And being like, this is what I'm paying. What are other people paying? And also putting it in a unit of, or a currency that the producers can understand. So like the producers can be like, well, X producer sold their coffee to Say at that, and I'm only getting this. So like, what's going on? Right. But that gets even more complicated, because then you're going into like, the what I would consider to be a pretty flawed system of, the way that coffee is traditionally purchased is, all of the power is held by the buyer. They coming in, they cup coffees, they give it a score. They say it's worth this much money. The producers have no idea if that's true or not, and they can decide to sell the coffee or not. So, until we can like actually, teach and train producers how to like actually taste and evaluate their own coffees in a way that we do. So, I can't go down and be like, this is an 82-point coffee. I'll pay X amount of money for it. Right. And they literally don't know if I'm telling them the truth or not. Yeah. That's a pretty flawed power dynamic.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah.
So I think that that's like a vastly important thing to consider as far as like, when we're dealing with prices, because like once you get into prices, you're also talking about quality of life, which I have no idea. I have no idea what the quality of life, or like the living wage should cost on a mountaintop in Nariño. Like I have no clue. And if you take that exact same thing to New York, I know people who, their standard of living requires them to make X amount of money. And I look at that amount of money and I'm like, I have no need to make that amount of money for the life that I would like to live.
Right,
So it's a very personal thing. And it's also very challenging to be, someone who lives in New York to go to a mountaintop in Nariño and be like, you don't make enough money. You need to make more.
Right.
It's like they, at the end of the day, they need to decide how much money their coffee needs to cost in order for them to live the life that they want to live. And the problem is they just don't have access to the information, and they don't have any knowledge about their product and the coffees that they're growing and what it could potentially be worth. And if they do need to make more money, they don't know how to get access to it. They don't know how to make their coffee better. So it's like all of the power is still being held by us as buyers, and it should be being held as held by the producers. If someone came to me and they were like, hey Lance, will you roast coffee 6 days a week for $20,000 a year? I would happily tell them to go fuck off. Because I know that that's not worth my time. But they just don't exist in that. They exist in a situation where like they're third generation coffee producers or whatever. It's the only thing they know. So if you offer them $20,000 a year to grow the best coffee in the world, they're like, cool, thanks. Because they have literally no other options for them. And it's just, I would really like to see the power dynamic shift from the buyer to the producer. And I think that the first way, or the most important, part of that is getting them to understand the value of their product, which is like they need to then be able to taste the coffee and know how good or not good it is.
But at least it seems that, you have some steps going forward that would be very constructive. It's not like you're totally like, I have no idea and it's totally a hopeless situation. You have some ideas. And obviously going from having some interesting ideas to actually implementing everything, it's a huge journey. But it's a huge journey, but it's an interesting one, at least for the sustainability, like the future of our industry. There's like a huge, problem from the picking side of things. Like, every place I go to buy coffee is a constant conversation around, not being able to find enough labor for pickers, which is like they're the like obviously last end of the, supply chain of coffee. So it's like if we want, single varieties separated, nano lots from 2 hectare farms at 200 meters above sea level, grown on elevations or like slopes like this that like blow our minds, we have to decide that we want to pay for that. And we haven't figured out what that means yet. But like if we don't figure out that, those coffees are going to disappear, and I don't even think very long. So but again, I don't want to. I don't want you to undervalue what you're contributing. And just again, sort of on a personal note, I have come back from many of our conversations and been filled with enthusiasm and inspiration. And so, for example, like arguing with Oscar about like, I want to pay more. I don't want to compete on the lowest common denominator. I'm not saying that we would anyway.
Of course.
But I want to pay more for higher quality coffee. I want to really value the high quality coffee and the work that entails. I want to pay more, and I want to charge our customers more for that. Really starting a conversation, as you spoke about earlier, about people's willingness to pay more for a really high quality product. That's one of the many things that I've, conversations that we've had that maybe not have originated, but at least I've had similar conversations with you. And
and I also think that we're it's like it's a whole thing. And, I think that it has problems from the origin of specialty coffee. If like you go back to, I don't know where like the origins of specialty coffee kind of like began in Europe, but like I do know where it kind of began in the States. And if you go back to like maybe the original, first specialty roastery, first specialty coffee shop, and you kind of like look at their model, they undercut Starbucks as like, cost per cup when they first opened, however many years ago, 15, 16, 17 years ago. But as like the specialty coffee, and, that's crazy.
Yeah.
And that kind of like, I still think that we're suffering from that choice from the beginning or the inception of what specialty coffee was. And, the only way that they were even capable of doing that from a financial perspective or a business perspective is because they had extremely cheap labor for coffee.
Right.
And, the kind of comparison that I generally like to make around that is microbreweries, which is like specialty beer. And that's obviously exploded, at least in the US. I assume that it's exploded also in Europe, but like it's massive industry in the US. But like when the first, craft breweries started opening, they didn't make a, dry hopped IPA and try to compete with Budweiser.
Right.
They were like, this is how much this beer costs.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to drink it?
Right.
And clearly a ton of people wanted to drink it, but they weren't like, we're going to try to make a dry hopped IPA and sell it for 50 cents lesser than a Budweiser.
Right.
Because literally they would have gone out of business doing so.
Yeah.
And, the only way that specialty coffee was able to do that and exist, but doing that by creating a better product than, commodity grade coffee, essentially, I guess Starbucks might be considered a specialty, I'm not sure, but was because they had extremely cheap labor. And, they didn't ask, like, this is what specialty coffee actually costs in a sustainable way. Does anybody want it? Just to find out. And I still don't think that we as an industry have actually asked that question in a real way. Just being like, this is what sustainable coffee costs. Does the world want it? And then we just know. But, it's a really complicated question, obviously. But I think that it is an interesting one. And it's a complicated one because like at the inception of specialty coffee, they were able to not ask that question because of, how cheap labor was in the places that coffee is grown. That gets into like, colonialism and all sorts of like, controversial things. But it's yeah.
So I want one last question, and which is basically going forward, SEY Coffee. I mean, obviously you're based in Brooklyn, and I assume a lot of your business is in New York City, a huge market of 10 or more million people.
14,
there's
I think,
14.
Yeah.
There's the United States, huge market, but you're also all over the place. I see you in Korea, Japan, the UK, all over Europe. Going forward, what's happening?
That's a really interesting question, and one that I unfortunately don't have a great answer for. I see kind of the specialty coffee market like transitioning and kind of like continuing to progress and morph and all of these things. And, kind of like the old roastery wholesale sort of like model, I don't think is as effective or as viable as it was, say, 5 years even. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but like access to roasting machines is probably like the biggest one, where like people kind of just have more access to roasting and can kind of start roasting on their own. If you're a decent coffee shop or you move decent volume, you used to be a very good wholesale account for a roastery. now you have access to roasting machines and you can try to roast your own coffee, for better or worse. And so like that's kind of like really changed the wholesale market for roasteries. So I don't honestly know what the future kind of looks like for us. Our direct to consumer sort of like market is continuing to grow, and that's kind of like been an interesting thing to explore. I don't know if this is actually where we'll end up going as a company, but like what I'm personally interested in is actually cafes. I don't think that there are enough really, really good coffee shops in the world. And I would like to see there be more better coffee shops in the world. And I just love cafes. I mean, like I said at the beginning, like coffee shop culture, hanging out in cafes was kind of like what got me into coffee at the beginning. And coffee shops is still really what I love. I love cafes. I like hanging out in them. I like going to them. I like seeing everything about it. I like, generally draws more progressive people, more progressive, interesting conversations happen at cafes. It's kind of a cultural center for people. And I really love that. So I would love to, potentially open up at least one more cafe. I know. And, I don't even think that it would necessarily be a say, to be honest. But, and because I do think that like multi-roaster concepts are like really interesting and really intriguing, and just getting more coffee roasted well, and doing coffee with, really high integrity from a coffee shop perspective is actually really rare in my experience. So trying to like execute that and also make that a viable business model, because like I know a lot of coffee shops, it's very challenging to like actually make money with cafes, but trying to figure out like what does a viable cafe look like from purely like high integrity, zero compromise on quality, really, really good coffee shop actually look like. I just think the world needs more of them. So I would love to, potentially try to do a little,
Super
something like that.
Last time I was at your shop, it was all about AeroPress now for filter. Is that? Yeah. Super interesting.
I mean, that goes back to your conversation about high extractions and, don't like, I'm not going to like die on this hill, but, what's been informing our approach to brewing coffee, roasting coffee, buying coffee is how do we get, and it comes from sustainability questions of like, just how do we get as much out of this raw product as we possibly can?
Right.
And really questioning the idea or the industry standard around over extraction, which I've moved so far away from even using that term. But with AeroPresses, you can grind crazy fine, throw really hot water on it, blink, and you've got an 80 or a 25% extraction. So it's just like, it makes extraction so much more efficient. Whereas like to get a similar extraction level out of a V60, like you can do it, but it like takes 8 minutes. And from a coffee shop perspective, that's not super viable. So like, that's kind of like why we've moved to AeroPress, just like because of the efficiency of extraction.
So full circle, 10, 12 years ago, standing, both Oscar and I, behind the bar at Drop Coffee, we had 8 Hario V60s. It was beautiful. Yeah. It was total chaos. Yeah. And very often, after 20 minutes after having ordered their coffees, people would be like, "Excuse me, where's my cup of coffee?" Yeah. And, we were brewing our 8 V60s, and it was...
romantic.
Yes, it was very romantic. That's very nice. Well, Lance from SEY Coffee, Brooklyn, we could go on forever, obviously, but I think we're done for now. Thank you so much for this conversation. My mind is exploding in a good way.
I hope so.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.